The morning mist of June 3rd, 1864, hung over the Virginia countryside like a funeral shroud, and Private Thomas McKenna of the 2nd Corps knew with grim certainty that it might as well be. As he sat in the pre-dawn darkness, his calloused fingers trembling, not from cold but from dread, he carefully pinned a small piece of paper to the back of his blue wool coat. Written in his wife's careful script were the words, "Thomas McKenna, Company K, 15th Massachusetts Infantry. Please send my body home to Mary McKenna, Salem, Massachusetts." All around him in the earthworks, thousands of other Union soldiers performed the same ritual. The soft rustle of paper and the quiet scratch of pencils filled the air as men wrote their final letters home, their names and addresses, their prayers and confessions. Some wept silently. Others stared with hollow eyes toward the Confederate fortifications barely visible through the morning gloom. They all knew what General Ulysses S. Grant's latest orders meant. Another frontal assault against entrenched positions, another dance with death. McKenna had survived Antietam, Gettysburg, and the Wilderness. He had seen the elephant, as the veterans called it, and lived to tell the tale. But Cold Harbor felt different. The Confederate positions stretched before them like a vision from hell itself, mile after mile of zigzagging trenches, artillery, emplacements, and abatis that would funnel attacking troops into killing fields. General Robert E. Lee had chosen his ground well, and every Union soldier knew it. As referenced in Bruce Catton's comprehensive work, A Stillness at Appomattox, the soldiers' intuition proved tragically accurate. Cold Harbor would become synonymous with military folly and unnecessary slaughter. The whispered conversations around McKenna revealed the depth of their despair. Sergeant William Collins from Maine spoke in hushed tones about the dream he'd had of his mother's garden. Corporal James O'Brien from New York carefully folded a photograph of his sweetheart and tucked it inside his jacket pocket. These were not the boastful words of men eager for glory, but the quiet preparations of those who had accepted their fate. McKenna closed his eyes and thought of Mary, probably at that very moment hanging laundry on the line behind their small house in Salem. Would she understand why he had to go? Would she forgive him for leaving her alone with their 2 young children? The questions tormented him, but duty called louder than doubt. He was a soldier in the Army of the Potomac, and General Grant had ordered them forward. The eastern horizon began to lighten, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to mock the darkness gathering in the hearts of 40,000 Union soldiers. Officers moved through the ranks, their voices carrying the familiar cadence of pre-battle preparations. "Check your cartridges, boys. Fix bayonets. Remember your training." But everyone knew that training meant little against the killing machine that Lee had constructed in their path. McKenna touched the paper pinned to his coat one last time, then gripped his Springfield rifle with both hands. Around him, the great blue machine of the Union Army began to stir, like some massive beast awakening from slumber. The time for reflection had ended. The time for dying was about to begin. Colonel Francis Barlow of the 2nd Corps rode his horse, slowly through the ranks of his division, his weathered face betraying none of the anguish that churned in his chest. At 29, he had already earned a reputation as one of the Union Army's most capable commanders, but Cold Harbor presented challenges that tactical brilliance alone could not overcome. The Confederate positions before them represented nearly perfect defensive terrain, and everyone from the lowliest private to General Grant himself knew it. The morning of June 3rd had dawned clear and humid, promising another scorching Virginia day. As Barlow surveyed the enemy lines through his field glasses, he could make out the Confederate trenches snaking across the landscape like scars on the earth. Behind those earthworks waited some of Lee's finest troops, veterans who had bloodied the Union Army from Bull Run to the Wilderness. They would not break easily, if at all. "Colonel, sir," came a voice behind him. Barlow turned to see Captain Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts, a young officer whose scholarly demeanor belied his courage under fire. "The men are asking about the assault, sir. They want to know, well, they want to know if there's been any change to the orders." Barlow studied Abbott's face and saw there the same question that haunted every thinking soldier in the ranks. Why are we doing this? The Confederate position was nearly impregnable. 3 previous assaults had failed with horrific casualties. Yet Grant's orders remained unchanged. Advance at dawn and carry the enemy works by storm. The orders stand, Captain, Barlow replied quietly. We attack in 1 hour. Abbott nodded grimly and returned to his company, where men sat cleaning rifles they knew might fire only once more. The ritual of preparation continued throughout the Union lines. Cartridge boxes were checked and rechecked. Bayonets gleamed, dully in the morning light. Officers synchronized their pocket watches with the precision of men planning their own funerals. Private McKenna found himself thinking of his father, who had died at Shiloh 2 years earlier. The old man had served with distinction in the Mexican War and had always spoken of the honor of military service. Would he be proud of his son now, McKenna wondered, or would he counsel retreat in the face of such obvious slaughter? The question tormented him as he checked his 40 rounds of ammunition for the 10th time. Nearby, Corporal Samuel Harrison from Vermont sat writing what he knew would be his final letter home. His hand shook slightly as he formed the words, "Dear Mother, if you receive this letter, it means I have fallen in service to our cause. Do not weep for me, but know that I died believing in the righteousness of our struggle to preserve the Union and end the curse of slavery. Tell little Sarah that her big brother thought of her at the end." The Confederate lines remained ominously quiet. Lee's soldiers had learned the value of patience, and they waited behind their earthworks like spiders in a web. General Ambrose Powell Hill's 3rd Corps held the right, while Lieutenant General Richard Anderson's 1st Corps anchored the left. Between them stretched nearly 7 miles of the most formidable defensive positions the Civil War had yet seen. 4:30 in the morning, the Union artillery began its preliminary bombardment. Cannon fire rolled across the battlefield like thunder, and smoke began to obscure the Confederate trenches. But the men waiting to attack knew that artillery alone would not decide this battle. They would have to cross nearly a mile of open ground under murderous fire, and most of them would not survive the journey. McKenna stood with his regiment, feeling the weight of his rifle and the paper pinned to his coat. Around him, 40,000 other Union soldiers prepared to write the final chapter of their stories in blood and mud. The assault on Cold Harbor was about to begin. At precisely 4:30 in the morning on June 3, 1864, the stillness of the Virginia countryside shattered like glass. The Union artillery bombardment began with a thunderous roar that could be heard 20 miles away in Richmond, sending shells screaming over the heads of the waiting infantry and into the Confederate trenches beyond. Private Thomas McKenna pressed himself against the earthwork parapet, feeling the ground shake beneath his feet as hundreds of cannon spoke in unison. But even as the artillery pounded the enemy positions, McKenna and his fellow soldiers knew it would not be enough. The Confederate entrenchments were too strong, too well constructed to be destroyed by cannon fire alone. They had been built by men who understood the deadly arithmetic of modern warfare, men who knew that rifle fire could kill at distances their grandfathers could never have imagined. The bombardment lasted exactly 30 minutes, then ceased as abruptly as it had begun. In the sudden silence that followed, 40,000 Union soldiers rose from their positions and began their advance. The sight was both magnificent and terrible, regiment after regiment emerging from the morning mist, their battle flags snapping in the breeze, their bayonets glinting like a forest of steel thorns. McKenna found himself moving forward with the rest of his company, his legs carrying him toward the Confederate lines even as his mind screamed warnings. To his left marched the Irish Brigade, their green flag prominent among the sea of blue uniforms. To his right advanced the Vermont Brigade, their steady ranks showing no sign of the terror that gripped every thinking man among them. The first Confederate volley erupted when the Union line had advanced barely 200 yards. The sound was like the ripping of some enormous piece of canvas, and suddenly men began falling all around McKenna. Private Collins from Maine, who had spoken of his mother's garden just hours before, spun and fell with a neat hole through his forehead. Sergeant Murphy from Boston clutched his chest and sank to his knees, blood spreading across his blue coat like spilled wine. But the advance continued. Officers shouted encouragement that was lost in the din of battle, and the survivors pressed forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The Confederate defensive line erupted in flame and smoke as thousands of rifles spoke in deadly chorus. Artillery added its voice to the slaughter, canister shot tearing great holes in the Union ranks. McKenna found himself running now, though he could not remember when he had started. The man beside him, a young corporal whose name he had never learned, suddenly threw his arms wide and fell backward, his face a mask of surprise and pain. Another soldier, this one from a New York regiment, began screaming and clutching a shattered arm, but the tide of blue uniforms carried him forward until he too disappeared beneath the trampling feet. The Confederate trenches seemed impossibly far away, though logic told McKenna they could not be more than half a mile distant. But that half-mile had become a killing ground such as the world had never seen. Rifle fire poured from the enemy positions in sheets, while artillery shells exploded overhead, showering the attackers with hot metal fragments. Colonel Barlow, mounted on his bay horse, rode among his men shouting orders that no one could hear above the din. A Confederate sharpshooter's bullet found his mount, and horse and rider went down in a tangle of legs and blue cloth. Barlow rose immediately, drew his sword, and continued forward on foot, his face grim with determination and growing despair. The paper pinned to McKenna's coat fluttered in the wind generated by passing bullets, and he thought briefly of Mary, reading the telegram that would inform her of his death. The thought gave him a strange peace, even as the world around him descended into chaos. He was part of something larger now, something that had moved beyond individual choice or fear. Ahead, the Confederate earthworks loomed like the walls of hell itself, bristling with rifle barrels and wreathed in smoke. McKenna knew he would never reach them, but still his legs carried him forward into the storm of lead and iron that was turning Cold Harbor into a charnel house. 300 yards from the Confederate trenches, the Union assault began to falter, like a great blue wave breaking against an invisible reef. Private Thomas McKenna found himself lying flat against the Virginia earth, pressing his face into the dirt as bullets whined overhead like deadly wasps. Around him, the remnants of his regiment had gone to ground, seeking any depression or fold in the land that might offer protection from the withering Confederate fire. The sound of battle had become a continuous roar that numbed the mind and set the teeth on edge. Rifle fire crackled like burning timber, while artillery shells shrieked overhead to explode in fountains of earth and shattered metal. But beneath it all, McKenna could hear something that chilled his soul, the cries of wounded men calling for help that would never come. To his left, Captain Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts tried desperately to rally his scattered company. The young officer stood upright despite the bullets that plucked at his uniform, his sword raised high as he shouted orders that were lost in the din. "Forward, men! Forward for the Union!" But his words seemed pitiful against the hurricane of lead that swept the field. McKenna raised his head cautiously and immediately saw why the assault had stalled. The Confederate position was even stronger than it had appeared from a distance. The trenches formed a complex pattern of interlocking fields of fire, with artillery pieces positioned to rake the approaches with canister shot. A bodice, sharpened tree branches, had been placed to channel attackers into killing zones where concentrated rifle fire could do maximum damage. Behind those trenches waited some of the finest soldiers the Confederacy had ever produced. These were not raw recruits but veterans of 2 years of hard fighting, men who had learned to load and fire with mechanical precision, even under the most extreme conditions. They held their fire until the Union soldiers were well within range, then unleashed volleys that cut down entire companies in seconds. The paper pinned to McKenna's coat had been torn by a bullet, and he could feel blood seeping from a shallow wound in his shoulder. But he was alive, which was more than could be said for thousands of his comrades. The field behind him was carpeted with blue-clad bodies, some lying still in death, others writhing in agony as they called for water, for their mothers, for God. To end their suffering, Colonel Barlow crawled up beside him, his uniform torn and muddy, his face blackened with powder smoke. The young colonel had lost his sword somewhere in the advance, and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. "McKenna," he gasped. "Can you see any way forward?" McKenna peered over a small rise and immediately ducked as a Confederate sniper's bullet kicked up dirt inches from his face. "No, sir," he replied. "They've got us pinned down solid. Anyone who stands up is a dead man." Barlow nodded grimly, had seen enough warfare to recognize an impossible situation when faced with one. The assault on Cold Harbor had failed, just as every thinking soldier had known it would. But Grant's orders had been explicit: carry the enemy works or die in the attempt. For thousands of Union soldiers, death had proven the more likely outcome. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the battlefield into a furnace of heat and horror. Men began to suffer from thirst as well as wounds, but any attempt to retreat brought immediate fire from the Confederate sharpshooters who had positioned themselves to command every fold and depression in the ground. The Union Army was trapped in no man's land, unable to advance and afraid to retreat. From somewhere behind the Confederate lines came the sound of cheering. Lee's soldiers knew they had won a great victory, that they had shattered another Union assault with minimal losses to themselves. The defensive tactics that had served them so well at Fredericksburg and other battles had proven their worth once again. McKenna closed his eyes and tried to shut out the sounds of suffering around him. The paper with Mary's name fluttered against his back, a reminder of the life he might never see again. The morning that had begun with such grim certainty had become something even worse. Not a quick death in glorious battle, but a slow agony. Under the merciless Virginia sun, the Battle of Cold Harbor was entering its bloodiest phase. And for the men trapped between the lines, survival had become a matter of inches and minutes. By 9 o'clock in the morning of June 3, 1864, the battlefield at Cold Harbor had become a vision from Dante's hell. Private Thomas. McKenna lay pressed against the earth, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood, listening to the agonized cries of wounded men scattered across the killing ground. The initial assault had lasted less than an hour, but its aftermath would torment both armies for the remainder of that terrible day. The Confederate trenches, now wreathed in drifting smoke, had become silent except for the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. Behind those earthworks, General Robert E. Lee's soldiers waited with the patience of experienced hunters, knowing that any Union soldier who showed himself would provide an easy target. They had inflicted a slaughter that would be remembered as one of the most one-sided battles in military history. Colonel Francis Barlow managed to crawl back to where remnants of his command lay scattered among the dead and dying. His face was grim as he surveyed the carnage that surrounded them. Of the nearly 3,000 men who had advanced with his division that morning, fewer than half remained unwounded. Many companies had simply ceased to exist, their members lying in neat rows where Confederate volleys had cut them down. "Sir," whispered Lieutenant James Morrison of the 15th Massachusetts, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that no one could hear above the din of battle. "What are we to do? The men can't stay here much longer. The sun's getting higher, and the wounded need water." Barlow looked back toward their own lines, now seeming impossibly distant across the corpse-strewn field. Between their position and safety lay 800 yards of open ground, commanded by Confederate marksmen. Any attempt at retreat would likely prove as costly as the original advance had been. "We wait for darkness," Barlow replied grimly. "It's our only chance." But darkness was still 9 hours away, and the men trapped in no man's land were already beginning to suffer from more than their wounds. The June sun beat down mercilessly on soldiers who had exhausted their water supplies during the advance. Delirium began to set in among some of the wounded, who called out for their mothers, their sweethearts, for anyone who might bring them relief. McKenna found himself thinking of home with an intensity that surprised him. He could almost see Mary hanging laundry in their small backyard, could almost hear their children playing in the street outside. The mundane details of civilian life, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning, the feel of clean sheets, seemed infinitely precious now that he might never experience them again. Around noon, a Confederate officer appeared briefly above the trenches, waving a white flag. For a moment, hope flickered among the trapped Union soldiers. Perhaps Lee would allow them to collect their wounded. to retreat with some semblance of dignity. But the flag disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, and the deadly silence resumed. The reality was that both armies were trapped by the logic of their situation. Grant could not order a retreat without appearing to admit defeat, while Lee dared not allow his enemies to withdraw unmolested, lest it encourage future attacks. So, the men lay bleeding under the Virginia sun while their commanders contemplated the political implications of mercy. Private Samuel Harrison of Vermont, who had written his final letter that morning, now lay with a bullet through his lung, each breath a struggle that brought bloody foam to his lips. He tried to call for help, but his voice was lost among the hundreds of other wounded men, who cried out in vain for water, for medical attention, for their mothers. As the afternoon wore on, some of the wounded began to crawl toward the Confederate lines, preferring capture to death by thirst and exposure. Most were shot down by nervous pickets who feared a trick. Others simply lay still and waited for death to claim them, understanding that they had become pawns in a larger game that no longer concerned itself with their individual suffering. McKenna checked his pocket watch, a wedding gift from Mary, and found that only 6 hours had passed since the assault began. It felt like a lifetime. The paper pinned to his coat was now illegible, stained with blood and dirt, but he could still feel it there, a connection to the world beyond this hell of smoke and suffering. Night could not come soon enough for the men trapped at Cold Harbor, but when it finally arrived, it would bring new horrors and difficult choices that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. As the sun began its slow descent toward the Virginia horizon on June 3, 1864, the temperature on the battlefield at Cold Harbor remained oppressive, but the quality of light began to change. Long shadows stretched across the killing ground, offering blessed patches of shade to the wounded men who had been baking under the merciless sun for nearly 10 hours. Private Thomas McKenna felt his cracked lips with a swollen tongue and tried not to think about the canteen of cool water that lay somewhere behind him with his dead sergeant. The afternoon had brought new torments beyond thirst and wounds. Flies, drawn by the smell of blood and death, swarmed over the battlefield in black clouds. They covered the faces of the dead and crawled across the wounds of the living, adding another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. Some wounded men had stopped crying out, either from death or from the simple exhaustion that comes when the human body can no longer sustain its protests against fate. Colonel Barlow had managed to establish communication with the rear through a series of crawling messengers, young soldiers who risked their lives to carry word back to division headquarters. The reports they brought were uniformly grim. General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the 2nd Corps, was beside himself with rage and grief at the losses his units had sustained. Nearly 7,000 casualties in less than an hour of fighting, a rate of loss that even the bloodiest battles of the war had not matched, but the tactical situation remained unchanged. The Confederate positions were as strong as ever, and any attempt at either renewed attack or organized retreat would likely result in even more casualties. Grant's headquarters had sent word that the men should hold their positions and await further orders, a phrase that meant little to soldiers lying wounded in no man's land with no positions to hold. As darkness finally began to fall, McKenna heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the distinctive crack of rifle fire from the Confederate trenches, followed by the agonized cry of a wounded man. The enemy soldiers were shooting the Union wounded who tried to crawl to safety under cover of darkness. What had begun as a military engagement was becoming something approaching murder. "Steady, lads," whispered Colonel Barlow from somewhere to McKenna's left. "Wait until full darkness, then we move together." But when full darkness finally came, it brought new horrors. The night was filled with the sounds of suffering, wounded men calling for water, for their mothers, for God to end their pain. Some had gone mad from thirst and exposure, babbling incoherently about childhood memories, or screaming at hallucinations that only they could see. Others lay silent in the grip of fever, their bodies fighting infections that would claim many of those who survived their wounds. McKenna began his crawl toward the Union lines shortly after midnight, moving inches at a time across ground slippery, with blood and strewn with the bodies of his comrades. Every few yards he was forced to stop and lie still, as Confederate sentries fired at shadows and sounds, their bullets whining overhead or kicking up dirt uncomfortably close to his position. The retreat, for that was what it had become, though no officer would use that word, took nearly 3 hours to complete. Men who had advanced across 800 yards in less than 30 minutes now required half the night to crawl the same distance in reverse. Some never made it, their strength giving out before they could reach safety. Others were killed by nervous pickets who could not distinguish between friends and enemies in the darkness. When McKenna finally rolled into the Union trenches, he was met by stretcher bearers and medical orderlies who worked by the light of shielded lanterns. His shoulder wound was cleaned and bandaged, and he was given a cup of water that tasted better than the finest wine. But even as he felt grateful for his survival, he could not stop thinking about the men who remained on the field. Some dead, others dying, all abandoned to whatever mercy their enemies might show. The paper pinned to his coat was gone, torn away during his crawl to safety, but McKenna no longer needed it to remember his name or his destination. He had survived the Battle of Cold Harbor, though thousands of his comrades had not. The experience would mark him for the rest of his life, a reminder of the day when modern weapons met outdated tactics with predictably horrific results. As dawn broke on June 4th, both armies began the grim task of counting their losses and burying their dead. The Battle of Cold Harbor was over, but its lessons would echo through military history for generations to come. Dawn on June 4th, 1864, revealed the full extent of the catastrophe that had befallen the Union Army at Cold Harbor. Private Thomas McKenna, his shoulder wound throbbing despite the laudanum the surgeons had given him, stood at the parapet of the Union trenches and stared out at a sight that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The field between the opposing armies was carpeted with blue-clad bodies, some lying in neat rows, where Confederate volleys had cut them down, others scattered individually where they had fallen during the chaotic retreat. The official casualty reports would take days to compile, but the preliminary numbers were staggering. General Ulysses S. Grant's Army of the Potomac had suffered nearly 7,000 casualties in less than an hour of fighting, a rate of loss that shocked even veteran officers who had witnessed the slaughter at Antietam and Gettysburg. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, fighting from prepared positions, had lost fewer than 1,500 men. Colonel Francis Barlow, his uniform still stained with mud and blood from the previous day's ordeal, moved among the survivors of his division with the hollow-eyed expression of a man who had seen too much death in too short a time. Of the 3 regiments that had advanced with such grim determination 24 hours earlier, only fragments remained. Entire companies had been wiped out, their colors now lying somewhere in the killing ground between the lines. "McKenna," Barlow called softly, approaching the private who stood staring at the battlefield. "How are you feeling, son?" McKenna turned, slowly, his eyes still focused on something far beyond the colonel's shoulder. "I keep thinking about the paper, sir, the one I pinned to my coat with Mary's address. Got torn off during the crawl back and now—" He paused, struggling to find words for thoughts that seemed too large for language. "Now I feel like I lost something important, like maybe I lost myself out there." The colonel nodded gravely. He had seen this before in men who had survived battles that others had not. A kind of spiritual wound that went deeper than any physical injury. "You didn't lose yourself, McKenna. You found something. You found that you could face the worst, that war has to offer and still come back. That's not nothing." But even as Barlow spoke these words of comfort, he knew they were inadequate. The Battle of Cold Harbor had been more than a military defeat. It had been a moral catastrophe that called into question the very nature of command responsibility. How many good men had died because their generals had ordered them to attack? Positions that any private soldier could see were impregnable. Throughout the day, flag of truce parties from both armies worked to collect the wounded who still clung to life on the battlefield. The Confederate soldiers who participated in this grim work were struck by the youth of many of the Union dead. Boys, who should have been home helping with the harvest instead of lying stiff and cold under the Virginia sun. Even the most hardened Southern veterans found themselves moved by the sight of letters from home, clutched in dead hands, photographs of sweethearts tucked inside bloody uniforms. General Robert E. Lee himself rode out to survey the field, accompanied by his staff officers and a few trusted subordinates. The Confederate commander's face remained impassive as he observed the carnage, but those who knew him well could see the pain in his eyes. This was not how he had wanted to win battles, not through such wholesale slaughter of brave men who deserved better leadership than they had received. In his tent that evening, General Grant sat alone, staring at the casualty reports that covered his field desk like accusations. The man who would later be remembered as the architect of Union victory was experiencing the darkest moment of his military career. The losses at Cold Harbor were not just numbers on paper. They represented thousands of individual tragedies, families destroyed, communities devastated. "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made," Grant would later write in his memoirs, words that carried the weight of genuine remorse for a decision that had cost so many lives for so little gain. McKenna spent his final night at Cold Harbor writing a letter to Mary, trying to explain what could not be explained, to describe experiences that existed beyond the reach of ordinary language. "I am alive and well," he began, though both statements felt like lies. He was alive in the technical sense, but part of him, the part that had believed in the glory of war and the righteousness of their cause, had died somewhere in that killing ground between the armies. The Battle of Cold Harbor officially ended on June 4th, though fighting would continue sporadically for several more days. But the real end had come in those first terrible minutes of June 3rd, when modern weapons had demonstrated their power to destroy human life faster than human courage could overcome human folly. For the men who survived, Cold Harbor became a measuring stick against which all future hardships would be judged. They had looked into the abyss of industrial warfare and somehow lived to tell the tale. But they would never again be the same men who had pinned papers to their coats in the pre-dawn darkness, knowing they faced almost certain death, but advancing anyway because duty demanded it. The Battle of Cold Harbor had ended, but its lessons would echo through military history, a reminder that courage alone is not enough when tactics fail to match the realities of modern war.